when I was pregnant with our eighth child, I was 8.5 months when my father, who was 63, died of cancer. And he was on the farm in his caravan because he wouldn't leave it. And I was blessed to be there, the actual point of him dying. And I had my baby, and I was working then part-time for the BBC as a receptionist. And over the next 2 or 3 years, as my daughter started to grow up, she started to resent the fact she felt let down that she never saw her granddad like her 7 siblings had. And she ended up telling me, I used to see him through your navel, because she knew I was pregnant with her. And I thought, well, I'll write a story about my dad so that she would get to know who he was. So I started longhand. I didn't use a typewriter or anything, and started writing this story. And I started from when I was born, and we moved to the farm when I was 2, and we were brought up with lots of siblings in a lot of poverty and all that stuff. And one of the publishers there, the producers, had a look at it, and he said it was worth publishing. And he typed every chapter up for me, bit by bit, and I've still got that original copy. However, it never got published. I tried a few times. I think it was too emotional. It was very much, I'd lost my dad, and he said he would hang around to see this baby, and he didn't quite make it. So I really think it probably wasn't at that point. It did get published many, many years later. So it wasn't my first book. And while I was trying to get it published, I wrote about 30 pages, and I thought, I'm going to write 3 books. One until I went to the boarding school, then another on boarding school and working, and the third one our married life, and that was my plan. So I got 30 pages written of my second book. By this time, we were into the late 80s. I left the job and I started a degree in divinity, distance learning. I was involved in the church. So into my second year of my degree, this youngest daughter was then 13, started to become very difficult, that we didn't recognize the signs because we knew nothing about mental illness. And she ended up suicidal because we did get an emergency appointment, but already we hadn't realized how ill she was. And I'd been supporting my mother for some time since my dad died, and she wouldn't tell anybody. She said she had me and God. She had an obsessive compulsive disorder, which got worse and worse because then she was on her own. And her religion crept into it, as well as the cleanliness aspect. And I didn't understand for a number of years. In fact, I found her a nuisance. But I realized she was ill. Not ill. She could go to church and read, she could play whist, but she had an illness that was taking over her life. And she wouldn't have visitors, and she couldn't pick anything up off the floor without washing it. It was really hard. So when my daughter took ill, I was finding it really tough. But I struggled through and got my degree. And when she was about 19, and after a couple of relapses, we revamped that first book, and we got it. I think she put it on a computer. I certainly didn't. And we added some fiction, and we made it into a kind of story, using the story that I'd written, but improved a lot, and a bit mystery in it with this character we put in. So it was only semi-true then, if you like. And then, because I didn't find the support I needed across my church and generally in the public, because we're going back a number of years about mental illness, and it wasn't understood, and the stigma was awful, I decided I would carry on and do a master's. I knew they'd let me research what I wanted to do. So I did a master's over 3 years, and I looked at support for families where there's mental illness, and especially church support, and did it make a difference, the spiritual side? And I got a distinction, much to the amazement of my tutor, who said I was too emotionally involved and I wouldn't reach the standard they wanted. And I thought, well, you shouldn't challenge me because I will do it. And the other tutor was fine. He took me on then, and he was a little bit anxious, I think. But anyway, I got my distinction. And the adjudicators, who looked at the dissertation, said they hoped I would get it published. And I thought, nobody wants to read a piece of dissertation. But I'd interviewed 3 clergy and a doctor with big questionnaires, and I'd interviewed members of the carers group I'd set up. I ran it for 20 years, people who cared for people with mental illness. And we brought a little scripture reading in, a little bit of faith and storytelling and consolation and comfort to each other. And I interviewed them. So what I decided to do, I would tell my story, then people would read it. So I started with my daughter at 13 getting drunk. You see, it was a cry for help. We didn't know. And I told the night 6 years of the story till she got better. And she did get better, and she went to Durham and got a degree. And she's a teacher in that profession, and she's married with children, and she's the most wonderful person. But she had a very rough through her teens. So that was my first book, but then you have to get it published, and I did. And then I tried my PhD because I met an Anglican bishop, because now I was going around the country with my books and giving talks in churches, at meetings. I did many, many churches in the Middlesbrough Diocese, took my books and sold them, because my idea was to raise awareness, help people to understand it's not people's fault if they can't help you, if they don't understand mental illness. And it's not the church's fault or the priest's fault if they don't know anything about it. So I decided, well, I was church and I ought to do something about it because I do understand it. So that's why I went round. So I saw lots of books, tried my PhD at Durham, distance learning mostly, under an Anglican bishop who was lovely and did understand, because he had a daughter who'd had a mental illness for years. But I'm a heart person, not a head person. And being grilled for an hour and a half by 2 professors when you've done 6 years of work on your big piece of work. And I wasn't very good at the interview, and they suggested I do another chapter and I could try again for an MLit. And I thought, I don't need letters after my name. I was only doing it, I thought if I got called professor, people would listen to me. I decided I would just get my second book published as it was. And I did.